Good morning, I'm Tommy. This is my partner in everything, Nathan, and this is the photo that we took of the Women's March in Boston. On January 21st, we were very relieved to actually see that there were many people that were concerned about the same issues that we were concerned about. But when we were walking home from the protest, we kept talking to each other about how ephemeral protests are. And we thought, wouldn't it be very powerful if we had a historical record of these protests so that we could understand some of the broader trends about what people are concerned about and also how those trends change over both geography and time. So we went home and we built it. We call our protest tracker Count Love, and we are counting protests against the current administration's policy agenda. So here's how it works. We have an adorable robot, a software robot, and every night it visits over 1,600 local newspaper and television sites. And it meticulously looks for words such as demonstration and rally and protest. And then we collect these articles and we manually read every one of them. And when we find a protest event, we note the date that it occurred, the general topic that people are protesting about, the location, and an attendance count. And we try to be fairly conservative with the attendance count. So if an article says that there are dozens of attendees, we'll note 10. If it says that there are hundreds, we'll note 100. And each night after we're done reviewing all these articles, we publish the data on our website, countlove.org. And we've also built some simple search and statistics tools so that anyone can go to the site and look at the full set of data. Okay, so now that you know a little bit about how Count Love works, we're going to share with you some trends that we see in the data. So we've learned about over 2,500 protests and about 5 million protesters. And this is a time-lapse animation of all of those protests. So the circles represent the relative size of the number of attendees. And these protests tend to fall into one of a handful of categories, ranging from civil rights, racial injustice, the environment, as well as complaints against the executive branch and the legislative branch. But notably, as you saw in the animation, the protests are not limited to just the coastal states or urban dense cities. They're everywhere, and people have been protesting in all months since January.
And so we kind of take this data from this time lapse and present it as a chart showing what brought people out to protest every week, broken down by those kind of high-level categories Tommy was mentioning, the immigration, executive branch, and such. And there have been a lot of protests that have garnered large headline news. You know, the March for Science, A Day Without Women, that brought thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people out to advocate for certain policy ideas. And these have been kind of nationally coordinated events. But it's also interesting to see that there's some substantial events that are not as coordinated, like the response to the first executive order on travel and immigration. This was a much more grassroots, kind of ground-up set of demonstrations that took many different forms, whether it was people going to their airport to help people through immigration and customs, or going to their city hall to advocate for a sanctuary city. There wasn't a single day, there wasn't a single body kind of organizing this response, but it still made a huge impact in kind of this response to the executive order. You'll also see that kind of mid-March and mid-May, it looks like there was a big lull in the number of people that came out. But we're going to take a slightly different chart that shows not the number of protesters, but the number of events that we saw. There were still a lot of big events, or there were a lot of events going on during those months. But they took a different form. They were much more localized advocacy, people who had held die-ins, who would go out and make their congressperson aware that they weren't comfortable with this new healthcare bill, or they were going out advocating for town halls. And so by having this kind of comprehensive resource where we have all these protests, we can see both these big name kind of headline grabbing protests, but we can also see this kind of local advocacy that's going on. We also have geographic data for where these protests are taking place. And so we're kind of curious to see if there are differences in what brought people out in different parts of the country. And so by comparing kind of the density of counties and saying, what's happening in the more dense, more urban counties and what's happening in the less dense, more rural counties, are people protesting about different things? And we're actually surprised to see that there was a lot of similarity in kind of the priorities of what sort of protest events were held in these different parts of the country. There's little differences. Immigration gets a little bit more attention in urban areas, and healthcare and environment get a little bit more attention in rural areas. But for the most part, people across the United States were coming out to protest a lot of the same topics and felt passionately about a lot of the same things. Since we have this geographic data, we can also look at kind of a state breakdown. And this is a cartogram where it shows not the geography of the country, but the population size. Each circle is sized by the population of the state. And they're colored based on how many protesters per capita we've seen there since inauguration. And so a big state like California is darker blue because there's been a lot of protesters per capita. A small state like Vermont, also very dark blue because it's one of the highest protesters per capita states. But you'll also see some of these interesting states from the last election, like Minnesota, Wisconsin, are pretty dark blue. There's people who are very engaged and feel very concerned about some of the directions that the current administration is going in. And so these are just some of the little trends that we can explore with the data in CountLove. We continue to update the site nightly, so we encourage you to check it out. It's countlove.org. And we'll continue to share trends and data that we find on that website. But we've also built a simple iOS app that allows people to submit protest information anonymously so that we can keep getting information about new events as they occur. And thank you for your time.
Thank you.